Luke here for Simbox, and welcome along to this week's episode of the Let's Talk Boxing podcast. Delighted again this week to be joined by my co-host, Ciaran of Southwest Boxing Media. Ciaran, how are we doing?
Yeah, I'm all good, thanks, Luke. All good, mate. Can't complain. Sun is out in Wales. Doesn't happen often, so we're being treated to a little bit of a summer now, so I can't complain, mate.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, for any of our international listeners or our international viewers, they don't realise over here in certain parts of the UK, I'm in Manchester, of course, you're down in Wales, that our summer can literally consist of 3 or 4 days of mid-20 degree temperatures, and that's us done for the year. So, yeah, we're certainly soaking up as much of this weather as we can whilst consuming as much boxing content as we can.
Certainly are, mate. Certainly are.
Yeah, of course. So we sit here now on the back of Derek Chisora, his impressive victory over Joe Joyce. Certainly the underdog going into the fight. I think it's fair to say, Ciaran, and he's shown his life in the old dog yet. It was a classic, but I'm not sure if it's a classic for the right reasons. This is the kind of fight for me, Ciaran, where I was watching it through my fingers at times. Some of the punishment that both fighters were taking in there, certainly in that ninth round when Joe Joyce seemed to be on top, maybe even looking for the finish. And then next minute he's on the seat of his pants. He's took out by Derek Chisora. He's on his ass, and he survives a knockdown. Then he comes on top again, and yeah, what a round, what a fight, and ultimately Derek Chisora is the victor, and both men shipped a hell of a lot of punishment in that fight, Ciaran.
Yeah, I think last week, Luke, when we were talking about it, I think the word we used was we were expecting a bit of a slugfest. And I think it certainly was that. It was never going to disappoint. I think it was always going to be all action. It was always going to be both men coming forward, throwing bombs, taking big, heavy shots from each other. It was always going to be that type of fight, and it certainly didn't disappoint in that manner. As you said, I think you called it last week. You said about those looping right hands that we see coming from Chisora that literally can land at any time. And I mean, to be fair to Joyce, I mean, we were talking about the juggernaut last week, maybe not being the juggernaut of old, and as we knew him before, maybe something had changed. Maybe we weren't seeing that old Joe Joyce. But to be fair to him, he took some heavy shots. I mean, he took some shots that most fighters are not taking. Most fighters are sitting on the seat of their pants, as you said. So he did take a lot. He took a lot, but then obviously in the ninth round, looping right down over, and he was down. But yeah, it was a really good watch. I did enjoy it. I got to be honest with you. And coming back to Derek Chisora again, we mentioned it last week. I mean, I think he said now he wants another two fights, and basically you're always going to tune into him. You're going to enjoy the build-ups. We've always enjoyed his build-ups. We touched upon that last week, but we just know now he just loves it. He enjoys himself. He loves this fighting lark, and I honestly think that he doesn't know what he's going to do with himself when it's all over. I mean, just to think now he's got two more fights in him. He's always box office. He's always entertainment, and he proved that again on the weekend. I mean, what can you see Derek Chisora doing when he does eventually hang the gloves up? Mental to think, innit?
Yeah, absolutely. It is one of those things. He's been around for that long now that you kind of you can't really see him going into training. I don't think he's going to be the type to go into the corner and have his own stable of fighters. I don't see him doing that. I don't think he's going to be the kind of guy that go into punditry too much. I think he's too much too strong minded. He's not going to comply to the big wigs at Sky Sports or the Zone or TNT as much as others fans will love his brutality and his honesty. I'm not sure he's too much by way of PC for those guys at the TV stations. I think hats off to Derek. 12 months out of the ring, and after 3 or 4 rounds, he looked like he was blown out of his ass, and that
Mm.
seems to be the norm now with Derek Shaw, where he looks like he's shot to pieces, he's done, he's on the verge of being took out, and then I can't think of another fighter off the top of my head, Kieran. Maybe you can enlighten me, but that can look like they're taking so much punishment and still be so dangerous. Even in that moment when he dropped Joyce, excuse me, he was backed up on the ropes as he was throughout the majority of the fight, and he was shipping some heavy punishment and explodes with that big looping right hand that sits Joyce on the
Mm.
ass of his pants. That pretty much secured him the victory. I think without that knockdown, it would have swung the other way. The judges' cards were quite close, and yeah, I think the good thing with Chisora, the good idea is that he said it's 2 fights, so we know it's not going to prolong into his mid 40s, and that he's going to stay on way too late into his career. For some people, it may already have been too late even at this stage. So we're not sitting here thinking, is he going to try and make another run at a world title? Is he going to have to take on a Johnny Fisher or a Fabio Wardley or a Moses Atalma or a Jared Anderson? Some of these younger killers, God forbid we ever seen something like a Daniel Dubois against Derek Chisora, fighters that could do him some real damage. So the fact that we know it's going to be two fights, it's going to be two fights of a certain level because he's not going to take pennies in his mind. He's going to want to get well paid. So it's going to take a certain type of fighter to make a fight with Derek Chisora to make financial sense. So I like the idea that it's a max of two fights because we can see the finish line for Derek Chisora. In terms of Joe Joyce, going off his social media, it doesn't look like he's ready to retire just yet. I really don't know. I struggle. If we're saying that, Derek Chisora's got two fights left, it's hunky dory. I'm not quite sure about Joe Joyce. I don't know the man's bank account, but I dare say he's not got as much money in the bank as Derek Chisora. So is he going to be comfortable enough to retire at this stage? Has he got other commitments away from the ring that are going to see him financially secure? It's a worrying scenario for Joe Joyce because let's have it right. He's going to go into his next fight, if there is another fight, firmly as the B side. He's going to have to take the smaller cut, and it's a long road back.
Yeah, do you know what? Like, obviously, before we jumped on the pod, I was thinking a little bit about Joe Joyce in particular, and like, what's the next avenue, what's the next route, and there's limitations now. I mean, he's not going to be able to call the shots on this. He's not going to be able to have maybe the fights that he wants. One that did spring to my mind, just as a bit of an out there one, was the Dillian Whyte fight, because Dillian Whyte is obviously, he's had his time out of the ring. We know the reasons why. I mean, obviously to do with the drugs and what have you. The failed drugs test, we should say. So I think that fight would make sense, a Dillian Whyte fight, because obviously Dillian has got to try and work his way back up to get his name back in the mix. I think that's a fight. I don't know about you. It's an exciting fight to think of.
Ciaran, because that was an interesting name that you said there in Dillian Whyte. Because do you think Dillian Whyte makes more sense as an opponent for Joe Joyce than it does a trilogy with Derek Chisora? Because I was going to get onto who would you pick, and I was going to say Dillian Whyte for Derek Chisora. I think he wants a fight in Manchester. They fought already in Manchester. That was an instant British heavyweight classic. So I was going to chuck Dillian Whyte's name in the hat for a Derek Chisora trilogy, but now you're saying you'd take Dillian Whyte for Joe Joyce. That's quite interesting. Would you say it makes more sense for Joe Joyce?
I think either or, mate, if I'm honest with you. And I think looking at it from Dillian's perspective, without going off too much now, because obviously we're talking about the fighters in question from the weekend. I think looking at it from Dillian's perspective, I mean, where he's at now in his career, I think whichever he could take, or whichever fight possibly could happen for him, he would take with open arms, because I think he's back in that place now where he just needs to get fighting again. If he wants to seriously have a go at things, if he's still got ambitions to go on and win a world title, which I'm sure he has, these fights, he's not really in a position now to call the shots. And obviously, there'll always be a lot of criticism over him now, given obviously what happened. So I think either or. And I got to be honest with you, both fights I would watch. Both fights I think would be exciting and dramatic. So yeah, I think going on to what you asked there, Luke, what's next for both men? I think Dillian Whyte could be a common denominator there with both men, and a potential fight for both men to look at as well.
Yeah, definitely. As we know, with this heavyweight landscape at the minute, fights are being made. There's Joe Parker there for somebody. There's Ajit Caballero we bigged up on last week's podcast. He's there for somebody. So certainly can see big fights for Joe Joyce and Derek Chisora in terms of being the B side. But Derek Chisora is not going to want to be the B side, really, is he, after a win like that? And Joe Joyce, I think, would accept it. So one fight that I always thought we was going to see, I'm not sure how likely it's going to play out, but I always thought there was going to be a Joe Joyce Daniel Dubois rematch, and maybe if it's a subject for a different podcast, but I see Anthony Joshua beating Daniel Dubois in September. So could Daniel Dubois and Joe Joyce run it back then? Is that a fight that could happen maybe later on in this year or early part of 2025? A Joe Joyce Daniel Dubois rematch? Do you think?
Quite possibly, mate. As you said, it would all depend on what happens when he fights AJ at Wembley. As you said, it's for another podcast, but I do agree with you. I'm leaning towards an AJ win. But I mean, if Dubois wins that, then obviously it's a non-starter of a conversation. He's that would be taking steps back. And I still think even if he loses to AJ, given where he's at now, given he's just he'll have fought twice then for the world title. Would Daniel look at that now and think, given that Joe Joyce has obviously come off 3 losses in his last 4 fights. An underwhelming performance against Akash Ali, who should be beaten most days of the week, you would say. Would Daniel look at that and think, am
Yeah,
I taking a step back? I
That's
get the
that
idea
was
of
my argument.
obviously,
Yeah, is Daniel
yeah,
Dubois now beyond that? You know, like I say, it seems
mm.
inevitable for such a long time. Win, lose or draw come September. Is Daniel Dubois beyond the Joe Joyce situation that he doesn't
but
actually
has he
get that
got
back?
demons, mate? Has he got demons that he feels like that,
That's
that he
that's the
needs
only
to
thing
sort
that's
of
going to make sense
rectify?
for him, isn't it? It's the only thing
Yeah.
that's going to make sense for him, that he wants to scratch that itch, if you like, that he wants to get
Mm.
that revenge. But yeah, and then certainly you got to look at the money that Daniel Dubois is going to have been making with these, the Jerome Miller fight, the Filip Ergovic fight, and now the Anthony Joshua fight. You know, he's not going to be chasing money. That's for certain. So yeah, I mean, it's certainly one that would make sense in terms of fights that we don't want to see. I'm going to put it out there, Ciaran. I don't want to see Derek Chisora take on Zhilei Zhang. That for me is macabre in the highest extreme. You know, it'd be like putting him in with Deontay Wilder times 10 at this point. You know,
Mm.
Zhilei Zhang is a really dangerous opponent for Derek Chisora. And the scary thing is, given Derek's antics in the build-up to this fight, that he lauded Zhang for what he'd done to Joe Joyce, and then in his post-fight interview with Coogan and IFL, he pulled out the face mask and he's quite derogatory, and he was saying he'd go to China for that fight. I could actually see it being marketable because they'll fabricate some sort of beef, and you just know what Derek will be like at a press conference
Mm.
with those two. But for me, as a sporting contest, that's not the kind of fight that I want to see. Somebody that has got fast hands, is incredibly powerful, is all wrong for Derek Chisora at this stage of his career, and for this stage of career for about the past 10 years. I think you need somebody that's going to be a bit slower, hold the feet a bit more in exchange with him. Don't put him in with Zhilei
I,
at this point.
Sorry to jump in there, Luke. I just wanted to throw it in as well. I think you need people around Derek looking after him now and being quite sensible and quite wise with this, because we know Derek would jump in with anyone. I mean, if you said to Derek now to jump in with Anthony Joshua, say Dubois couldn't fight Anthony Joshua and Derek Chisora was off, it would never happen. But if he was off and you said jump in, he would do it. He'd fight anyone, Derek Chisora, even at this point now of his career. The man just loves fighting, and the man has no fear. Probably the biggest set of balls in boxing to take. There's not many bigger.
Mm.
And he's that type of guy. So I think you need people around him to make sure they are looking after him and choosing these next 2 fights. Yes, they need to obviously appease Derek. Of course they do. He's going out. It's his swan song, shall we say, his last 2 fights. And they need to be exciting, which I'm sure they will. They always are when Derek's involved in them. But we've got to be careful, although this is a gladiatorial sport we're looking at. I mean, this is a man who is a family man as well, when we look into the bigger picture of things. And we've been saying for some time now, how many's too many.
Mm.
And if that fight had gone the other way on the weekend, we wouldn't even be talking about another fight, Luke. We'd be firmly saying, I'm sure, enough's enough, Derek. Yet again, we're saying it. You've got to walk away from the sport. So I think you do need people, sensible people around him, just making sure that these next 2 fights are logical and sensible picks for Derek. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely agree. I couldn't agree anymore, Kieran. At the opposite end of the fighting age scale, if you like, on Saturday night was Moses Atama, and I'm going to take this opportunity to gloat, to big him up, to champion him, because last week, Kieran, you told me to rein it in a little bit, to hold my horses, to not big him up too much, not get carried away. But he stopped Marius Wack in 2 rounds quicker than anyone's ever done it. And of course, Marius Wack isn't the fighter that he was. He's not as compact. He's not as sturdy as he once was. But just 12 months ago, he went the full distance with Fraser Clark, who's a British title challenger. Moses Atama at 19, blasted him out of there in 2 rounds. What a performance from Moses Atama.
Yeah, mate, I nearly phoned in sick on the podcast today because I knew you were going to bring this up and sort of say I told you so. Yeah, maybe we shouldn't slow down. Maybe we shouldn't. Maybe he proved me and a lot of people wrong on the weekend. I was very, very impressed. We all expected him to win. As you said, this is a whack that we're looking at who's very, very much on his last legs, on his last days in terms of a boxing career. But it was just what I was impressed with, like how emphatic it was and how quick it came and how sort of brutal and destructive it was in putting him away. He didn't mess about. He proved his finishing quality, which is something that we like to see from heavyweights. And I had thought that he was going to put on a bit of a boxing display, if I'm honest with you. I thought it was going to go a lot longer. If there was going to be a stoppage, maybe the back end. But I thought he was just going to put on a bit of a masterclass boxing display. So to do that and to do it as early as he did, yeah, it was a bit of a statement. As I said, we got to bear in mind this is a whack who's done, but still, you've got to look at that. Given what you said about Fraser Clark, and where Fraser Clark is at, and we look at that fight with Wardley, it does make you look at it and think, this guy is moving. He's moving very very quickly, and he's showing us things that we want to see. What we want to see from a heavyweight at this point in his career. So it's exciting, mate. It is.
Yeah, absolutely. And he's not blessed with the at 19. He's not blessed with the outspokenness of a Derek Chisora or a Tyson Fury or a Deontay Wilder. But I think that adds to the mystique of the man. At 19, that he's almost systematic, robotic, like that. Like a young Mike Tyson, the way he just go about his business. It's all business. That's all it is. He's not here to talk. He lets his fist do the talking, gets in the ring, gets the job done, gets out there onto the next. And in that respect, I'd love to see him get added to that Wembley bill. Keep him active, get him out. It was 6 weeks away. He didn't take any punishment on Saturday. He's young enough to be able to take a week off, if that, and then have another 4 or 5 week camp. Get him back out on the September 21st card and just keep the ball rolling. He's young enough. He's fresh enough.
I got a question for you, mate. Could he beat both men that was in our main event on the weekend yet? Or are we getting too
That
much
was
ahead of
certainly
ourselves?
no, that was certainly a question I was going to bring up, and it'd be a sink or swim moment, wouldn't it? That all the questions would be answered. But let's put it this way: if they made one of those two fights in December this year, which is when Derek Chisora was looking at fighting next, if they made Derek Chisora against Mosley Atama, Mosley Atama would be the betting favorite, guaranteed, and he'd be odds on to win by knockout. Um, I think he'd stop both men, and I think he'd stop both either man inside 6 rounds, and that's with all due respect. He has the poise, the personality, the calmness of a guy that's 10, 15 years older than what he is, that he's had 15 times as many fights as what he's had, because he just carries himself in such a way. And I guess that goes back to the stories that we hear of him sparring Joe Joyce when he was 15, and he was in the mix with some of these top heavyweights when he was barely out of his school uniform. So I think he's got that calmness, that confidence from working in the gyms with these guys, because it's
Yeah.
a scary prospect.
He's been to the School of Hard Knocks, isn't he? Very young, as you can see.
And graduated with honors. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Ciaran, I'll flip the question back to you. Do you think he beats either a Joe Joyce, Derek Chisora if they fought in 2024?
Yeah, I certainly think with Derek, I think he'd definitely be a betting favourite in that. Going back to Derek's looping right hands, who knows again? But yeah, I think he would against Derek strongly. And I gotta say, based on what we've seen from Joe Joyce, and I don't want to keep hammering him because who am I to sit here and hammer him? But I gotta say, based on what we've seen in his last 4 fights and what we see him from Moses at the moment, I think you've got to have Moses as a favourite in our fight as well going into it. And as I said, we're just talking about just now about fights that we don't want to see for Derek, but I think as in terms of a fight for Moses, I think it would make a lot of sense, if I'm honest with you, a Moses fight against Derek Chisora. I think if that fight was offered to him, where he's at now in his career, and with Derek still being a bit of a sort of gatekeeper in the division, if you like, I think it'd make a lot of sense for Moses at this point in his career. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I think, if we're talking fantasy booking with Derek Chisora, I think the financial side of things would make that fight a no-go. And I think in terms of stature, it depends on whether they're going to. When he first turned pro, when he signed with Frank Warren, it was a huge coup. You wondered if he was going to go down that line of trying to make him the youngest heavyweight world champion in history and beat that Mike Tyson record, and then that seemed to have got reined in a little bit. So if they're going to continue with that and look to go towards becoming the youngest heavyweight world champion and breaking that record, then jumping in with somebody like Derek Chisora next is that kind of jump that you're going to have to make. It'd be Derek Chisora, then a top 15 ranked opponent, then a world title. That's what they'd have to go down. If they're not, if they're going to rein him in a little bit and take the time, you'd probably then target the winner of Solomon Dakers and David Adelaide when that English heavyweight title fight gets remade, which was postponed the week before. Looks like it's going to take place later in 2024. So then you'd get out again, Mosley Atama, maybe twice in 2024, and look to make him versus the winner of that for the English title in early 2025, and then move on to British, European, Commonwealth if they're going to go down the traditional route. But if they're looking at breaking that record and getting a world title shot on him, because let's say, for instance, Daniel Dubois beats Anthony Joshua, and that's an in-house fight that, again, he beats a Joe Joyce or a Derek Chisora next Moser Talma, then would Frank make Daniel Dubois against Moser Talma in 2025? And look to break that record. I think it all comes down to which path they're going to take with him. Break the record or go traditional. So I think that kind of is the decision next. He was on Sky Sports, the Sky Sports Boxing podcast today, and I've just got the names here. He mentioned Justice on here, Dempsey McKean, Simon Keane, Tom Schwartz, Solomon Dakers, David Adeleye, Fraser Clark, Johnny Fisher. He's 19 years of age, and he beats the majority of them for me inside the distance, and any of the others that I don't feel he stops inside the distance are 50-50 fights. I believe in him that much. The way he spoke on that podcast as well really blew my mind. That he kind of gave Johnny Fisher the props of, I watched him against Alan Babbage. I didn't expect that finish, and I thought he was just a ticket seller. Now I realise he's not just a ticket seller, so now he's on my radar. This is a 19-year-old kid saying Johnny Fisher's now on my radar. Not, hopefully I'm on his radar, and he might look at me as a credible opponent. He's now saying, no, I see him. So yeah, just everything about the kid. I'm fully on the hype.
I think the most logical for me, if I was looking after him and I was guiding his career, I think the most logical for me, I'd be looking at if the Clark Wardley 2-fight happens, the rematch, I'd be targeting the winner of that. I think that's where I'd be looking. I think I'd be looking
the English
beyond
title at that point.
Yeah, I think I'd be looking beyond the English personally. Just me, and that's no disrespect to obviously Solomon and any fighters fighting around that level. I would just be personally looking to push him onto that British straight away because I think he is good enough. I think he's showing that, and yeah, why not? And I think if they're talking about pushing him as quickly as they have been, then I think it would make more logical sense to target straight away, winning that British title, and then moving on from there. So yeah, that personally would be where I would push him if I was guiding him.
Yeah, it's certainly going to be an interesting journey to follow. Ciaran, before we move on to this week's massive Riyadh season LA card, was there any of the undercards of Derek Chisora and Joe Joyce, aside from Moser Talma, any other fights or fighters or performances that stood out and caught your notice?
I'm going to not do you justice here, mate, and I'm going to lay you down a little bit. I didn't see it all, mate, because I was out. I saw, obviously, highlights of certain things and certain fights, but I haven't actually got around to watching back the full fights on the undercard. So I don't think it's fair for me to give my say on things without watching it in full. But what about yourself, Luke? Anything stood out for you?
Yeah, I think Ryan Garner's win over Archie Sharp was impressive, and Dennis McCann beating Baluta. There was a lot of controversy around that first fight. It was a fight I thought he was in trouble in the first time around. He's now beat back-to-back, good wins for Dennis McCann, culminating in the Baluta victory and winning that European title. So yeah, certainly Dennis McCann, he's one to keep an eye on, and that was a career best win on Saturday night. But we'll move it forward, Ciaran. Riyadh season, they've covered some spectacular events so far: Knockout Chaos, the anti-Joshua Deontay Wilder doubleheader, Ngannou against Fury, Usyk against Fury. Some of the best cards of certainly my lifetime and some of the best cards in boxing history. We get the LA edition this Saturday, and it pits Israel Madrimov, the WBA super welterweight champion, taking on pound for pound superstar Terence Crawford, 3-weight world champion, looking to become a 4-weight world champion. And it's a star-studded undercard, plenty to get stuck into, and it's a card that I'm really looking forward to, Ciaran.
Yeah, same, mate. As you said, these cards just keep being delivered time and time again, and obviously as boxing fans, it's what we want, everything we want to see and more. Really, really looking forward to this. I love Bud, I love Crawford, I really do. As you said, one of the pound for pound best, arguably the best with some. Some would have their opinion that he is their best. They are picked for number one. And I think he's not chasing greatness, he's delivering greatness. I think that's the way to put it when you talk about Bud, because he is just unreal, mate. I mean, you just talked about it there. I mean, he's been undisputed at 2 different weights, 3-weight world champion, looking to become 4-weight world champion. And, it's very, very doable. I like Madrimov. I do at Madrimov. I think he's a really good fighter. He's undoubtedly, I think, the best at 154. He's carries a bit of power. He's got very good footwork. He's an awkward customer. It's not going to be an easy night for Bud. But you just look at Bud and you just think like we're talking about an elite fighter, and as good as Madrimov is, and the sort of the amateur background, there's not many styles he wouldn't have seen with the amateur background that he's got. he will have seen everything. But has he seen or has he run into a really, really elite fighter yet? Like Bud, remains to be seen.
He's not, you know, that win against Kubanov last time out when he won the world title and he stopped him in 5 rounds. That's when he really caught my eye. Of course,
Mm,
Madrimov, part of the matchroom stable, and Eddie's been championing for a long time. But then you kind of look at it and you think, like you say, take away Kubanov, there's not too much by way of world class victories. He's only had 11 pro fights. He turned pro in 2018, and you're kind of thinking,
mm,
11 fights in 6 years at the start of your career. Some fighters do that in 3 years, in 2 years. He's really jumped in at a deep end after 5, 6 wins. He took on like Sorrow and, as I say, Kurbanoff for the world title. Crawford, on the other hand, is touching 40 fights, somewhere around that. He's won
mm,
world titles in 3 weight classes. He won every fight at welterweight by knockout, obviously culminating in that fantastic performance and stoppage victory over Errol Spence when we finally got that fight this time last year. So yeah, the more I look into it, the more I think, Crawford started off at 135, won at world titles 135, 140, 147, now 154. Sometimes you'd be thinking, is it a step too far? At this stage of
mm.
his career, is it because he's not cutting weight at 147, so he's going to go 154 to make it an easier weight cut? But I just think, as you say, he's not chasing greatness, he's delivering greatness. He could have said at 147, look to beat other fighters, but he was already undisputed. So, move on and try and conquer another division. And yeah, we'll get into our predictions as we move on. But I think this is set up for another explosive Terence Crawford victory, because it seemed for a long time until he got that win over Errol Spence that he wasn't really appreciated. I don't know if you agree or disagree, Kieran, that he wasn't fully appreciated by even American fans. He's out there in Omaha, Nebraska, and maybe because he wasn't from a New York with Madison Square Garden behind him, or a Vegas native, or somewhere that was a bit more of a marketable part of the country, that he
Yeah,
struggled and strived for so long, that he was with Top Rank for so long. So all the other welterweights seemed to be on the other side of the street, which is a terminology I hated in American boxing, when one fight is with Top Rank and someone else is with PBC. So that was stopping all the big fights getting made. So now it finally feels like he's getting these flowers. He's not going to be somebody that has to retire for people to appreciate his greatness, that he's at the tail end of his career. He's finally getting the appreciation he deserves.
yeah, I agree with about the appreciation thing, Luke, because it reminds me a bit of with Josh Taylor over here. Like, when we looked at Josh Taylor and like obviously, we're talking about somebody who's been an undisputed world champion. There's not many people who go out there and do that. That is an unbelievable achievement. And for so long, especially over here, Josh Taylor, let's be honest, hasn't had his props. He hasn't been given the credit he deserves. And it reminds me a bit of that. Now, whether that's something to do with Top Rank, I don't know, and the promotion value there, I don't know. We can only speculate. But we talk about Bob Arra, mind, who's promoted some of the very, very best of all time. So who am I to sit here and say that? But yeah, going back to what you said, Luke, it seems like now the people are, legitimately giving him his props and talking about him in the conversation that he deserves to be in. With obviously when we talk about pound for pound and we talk about the likes of Usyk and Nue, Canelo's and all these fighters that we've seen, and his name is very much firmly in there now, and rightly so. He really, really is special, mate. He is, and as I said, Madrimov, he's a very good fighter, but I just worry, as I said, given I know he's got that amateur background, but I agree with what you said. I mean, in the pro ranks, I don't think he's running into anything like Terence Crawford yet. But as you said, the only question marks that will be put over Bud, I think, is when is when he was taking a step too far. That'll always be asked every time he goes up the weight. If he comes through on the weekend, you're talking about you going up to fight Canelo now. That's the strong rumours we see in. And again, we'll be saying then, when is it going to be one step too far? And don't forget, he's not young anymore either, Luke. He's an old man, older man, I should say. He's not looking like it, but fighters sometimes overnight can turn into an old man. I don't think it'll happen with Crawford just yet, but it's always a question mark you got to raise.
Yeah, the ironic thing is there, you mentioned Canelo, is that I see parallels in terms of the dominance of Crawford moving up through welterweight into 154, and now people clamoring for that Canelo fight as if, it's a realistic fight and a fight that maybe you consider 50-50 that you'd give Crawford a shot of winning. I draw parallels with Canelo's journey himself, the way he went up through super welterweight, middleweight, undisputed
Mm.
at super middleweight, and then he defeated Crusher Kovalev, won a 175 title, and then before he took that Bivol fight, there was even talks of him going up and fighting Alexander Usyk, which seems bizarre now. And it was only when he run into the speed bump that was Dimitri Bivol where we all kind of went, right, okay, let's rein it in a little bit here. He's only 5'8". He's not going to go up to heavyweight. He's not going to be Roy
Mm.
Jones. And maybe, I'm not saying Madrimov's going to be that guy to Crawford, but maybe at some point Crawford takes one step too far and we go, okay, Canelo was the dream. That's not going to happen. Let's rein it in a little bit. I see parallels there in terms of going up those weight classes.
I just hope that there hasn't been any distraction. I don't think they will, because I think Crawford, given, he's seen everything, he's done everything in the sport. He's an elite operator, as we've said, and an elite professional of that as well. But I just hope all this noise around the Canelo fight isn't a distraction, because we've seen it before. We saw it with Anthony Joshua, don't forget, a few years back, when obviously Ruiz came in and beat them. I mean, there was talks about other things going on for Anthony Joshua at that time. There was still talks about the Fury fight and other things, the Wilder fight and what have you. I just hope that all this noise around Canelo isn't a distraction come Saturday night. I don't think it will be. I expect Crawford to get the job done. But, these are things that you have got to throw into conversations about the fight as well.
Absolutely, Ciaran. We're going to close out the podcast with not one, not two, but three predictions this week. Usually we only have the one big fight prediction, but I think there's a couple of other fights on this card that's worthy of a prediction. So let's start off with the main event, WBA Super Welterweight World Title. Israel Madrimov, against Terence Bud Crawford. I think it's my turn to go first, isn't it? After last week, I think
It
you
is,
went first.
mate.
Yeah, so I've
It is,
alluded to
mate.
it
You
already.
go.
Yeah, I think the switch hitting style of Crawford, we've seen that he's carried the power up through the weights, that he was knocking people out at 147 for fun. And I'm going to go out on a limb here. I think he's going to stop Israel Madrimov, and I think he's going to get it done in the second half of the fight. I think it could be quite cagey to begin with, but the angles, the punch variety, the power in both hands from Crawford is going to be the like of what Madrimov's never seen before, who is a solid operator in his own right. But on Saturday night, we're going to see the difference between a world-class fighter in Madrimov and a truly elite pound-for-pound superstar in Terence Crawford. And Crawford's going to become a full-weight world champion via stoppage.
Yeah, I agree, mate. I do. I see a Terence Crawford win. I see a Terence Crawford stoppage win, and I'm looking at round 7 to 8. I just think, as we've said, without repeating what you've just said and what we just talked about, an elite level operator, and I think he'll show every bit of that worth in that ring on Saturday night. And I think the power will be carried up to this point. Whether he'll go beyond if he fights Canelo, whether he'll keep carrying that power remains to be seen. But I think for now, up at 154, I think the power will go up with him, and I expect him to.
Yeah, so two fights that are on the undercard that probably deserve more of a discussion than we've given them, but unfortunately we are, time constrained here on the podcast. We try and discuss as much as we can, and we will give them their just dues on next week's podcast with a review. But two fights we're going to predict here, Ciaran. Two heavyweight fights. Andrew Ruiz against Jarrell Miller. Give it to me. How's that going to play out?
Jarrell's just going to stand there again, isn't he? And he's just going to get absolutely hammered. I mean, it frustrates me talking about Jarrell because I've got my opinions on him, as I'm sure we all have. We haven't got time to go into it. Andy Ruiz wins for me. Andy Ruiz wins. I just think the experience. He's looking fitter. He's looking like he's got himself back in the shape and the frame of mind as well. I would say that he needs to be in to win big fights in the heavyweight division. And I think a professional job. I think Andy Ruiz wins. Does he stop him? Possibly. But he is a tough customer, Jarrell Miller, and he does stand in front of you and take an awful lot. So stoppage win, possibly late. I'm going to go with Andy Ruiz stoppage win late in the fight.
This is interesting. I think this is going to be the first time in our third podcast where we've disputed a result. So I'm going to go with Jarrell Miller here. I think Andy Ruiz has never been the same fighter since he hit the jackpot against Anthony Joshua. And I mean the jackpot in terms of the financial reward that he was paid handsomely for the first fight, even more handsomely for the return fight. And he's not quite had that hunger, which, I think Andy Ruiz is one of these fighters that's better as a challenger than a champion. And I think Jarrell Miller, if the rumours are true, he's dropped around 40 pounds. He has a high punch output. Again, I'm not going to let my thoughts and opinion of Jarrell Miller, similar to yourself, impact my prediction because his outside of the ring record and behaviour isn't something we champion here. But we've got to take the fight for face value, and we're predicting the fight as it is on Saturday night. And I think Jarrell Miller will win a close, competitive fight. but I think he wins on points, Ciaran. Let's close out the podcast with another fascinating heavyweight fight and one that really took me by surprise. Jared Anderson taking on Martin Bakole. I think it's safe to say Martin Bakole is more well known on British shores than he is in America. And I certainly think Jared Anderson and his team and his matchmakers could be overlooking the big Martin Bakole, Billy Nelson's charge, who's been brought in reasonably late notice. Yeah, tell us your thoughts on Jared Anderson, Martin Bakole, Ciaran.
Yeah, I agree. Are they overlooking him? Because this is a man, I think he's become a little bit of a bogeyman in the division. I don't think there's many that call out Martin McCauley, and I think there's a reason for that. I think based on sparring, maybe, and things that they've seen from him behind closed doors that we haven't seen. And also, given what we have seen from him in the ring so far, he's been impressive, you know. So, yeah, there is a little bit of maybe, are they overlooking him? Have they done their homework, shall we say? Have they done enough homework? And this could be one of them that, you know, it could be a spanner thrown in the works here, Luke. I do like Anderson. I think he is exciting. He's obviously where America are pinning their hopes now as the next heavyweight to come through. Obviously, with Wilder obviously done as well now. They're pinning all their hopes on him. It's a tough one, mate. I got to be honest, it was really tough. Oh, I'm sitting on the fence massively here, mate. Then we run out of time as well, mate.
Don't be getting splinters.
I'm gonna go. I'm gonna go with Martin. I think Martin does it. Yeah, I think they've overlooked him, mate. I do. I think just the experience and I think the things that we talked about, things that other fighters have mentioned about Martin and how he's avoided. Yeah, I don't think they've done enough homework on this one, and I think Martin's going to come through.
Yeah, so this is another one we can agree on. I think Jared Anderson is a great talent. I think at 24, 25, he's got time on his side to rebuild, and I think he will need to rebuild after Saturday night. Bakole, with his wins over Tony Yoka, amongst other fighters, he's shown that he can go as the away fighter and upset the apple cart. I'm going to go with a Martin Bakole win by stoppage, but if it goes to the cards, I think we could see, a home decision for Jared Anderson because it will be a competitive fight, but ultimately I'm going to predict a stoppage win for Martin Bakole. Guys, as always, make sure you let us know your predictions, whether you do it in the comments, whether you do it via our social media accounts. Make sure you hit the like button, give us a comment, give us a share, make sure you subscribe. Ciaran, thanks for joining me on this week's podcast, and we'll catch everybody on next week's episode.